Nice. Okay, so yeah, it's really interesting for me to do a lab on design prototyping, because this stuff is, I've been doing it for so long, I kind of forget what I need to talk to and show people, etc. So I have prepared some bits and I'm going to go through it, but I'd like to just start, and I'll share my screen in a second, but I'd like to start by saying, if there's anything that anyone specifically has in terms of questions or things that they're really curious about, like how to work through this process, and anything around sort of like ideation, inspiration, or anything else, or even kind of like creating prototypes, just let me know. I'm not sure what level of abstraction to go through. So whenever anyone is like, wants to say anything, feel free to just jump out and say, oh, Cassius, what about this or anything else? I have a feeling that within this whole block, I'll kind of compress things a little bit less than an hour. So there'll be plenty of time for like Q&A and maybe some like, fun fucking around with like design tools in the process anyway. So let me quickly go on to share my screen. And then hopefully you guys will all be able to see it. If someone can give me a nod, that would be awesome. Cool. So, oh, bloody hell, what is prototyping? So I suppose the best way to look at this is, I use Figma for all of my prototyping stuff. I used to use Sketch, and then probably within the last year or so, I just moved to Figma. Sketch means I have to use all kinds of like fun tools that are like much more high level than I actually want to use. Whereas with Figma, it's quite simple. It's not rocket science by any stretch. And I'm not going to go through the process of actually kind of like linking things together here. But if if that's something you'd like, I can probably do that at some point another time on a separate call, so that we don't bore everyone's senses here. But let's just kind of go through. I've prepared a few things, but I'm going to start with essentially like some high-level conceptualizations of things. So the real question is, why should we prototype anything? And the answer is sort of to define where from here. So the goal of a prototype really is to usually solve some kind of problem or answer some questions that we have. And typically that's defined by essentially the problem statements. So when I create a prototype, or ultimately I start to put these things together with teams of people or anyone else, I really try and figure out what is the goal of the prototype or the comps or anything in between. And the problem statements are a really good way of sort of defining that. And for anyone that's not familiar with a problem statement, it tends to be a very open-ended question, something along the lines of, how might we? And when you start to think in those terms, like how might we do X? Well, then, you can come up with fun solutions, and that's what you can use prototypes for. There's a lot of other different use cases, but that's typically a good reason to create a prototype in the first place. And typically the problem statements will be defined by, if this moves, the vision statement. And the vision statement is a nice kind of way of looking at all of those fun articles you've probably seen with the Amazon backwards press release and everything else. It's kind of like, what do you want things to be like in the future? So, ultimately everyone has an idea of what things could be or how they might be. And then the problem statement sort of says, well, here we are now, what are those next steps? And prototypes kind of answer that. And then typically once you create a prototype, you kind of let that do the work, but more often than not, prototypes actually create loads more work, because you realize that actually the problem statement you tried to solve, the vision statement and everything else, you're actually nowhere near as smart as you think you are, which is always lots of fun, but that tends to be the consensus of things. So if I was to give you, because I think this now is a good time, so if I give you a really, really simple example, so here is just an archived file of some work I did when I was working with another SPC member called Murti on a nonprofit called Pledges, which wasn't even a super heavy tech platform, but it was just, again, there was lots of design work, there's lots of prototyping required. And this is just an archive. This is kind of like, everything from what this could be and everything else. And we created a shitload of prototypes. And ultimately, 90% of this work was never used. And, it varies from really quick, ugly, dirty things where I'm just grabbing like stock illustrations and everything else to creating like, very granular user flows for kind of developers, etc. But I'll get into that a little bit later. So that tends to be the kind of process of prototyping. But the key here is try and keep it as simple as possible. It's very easy to create a mess of a prototype that has to do a load of things. But typically, if you have one goal for each prototype that you create, life gets a bit more simple for you. And so to give you some examples in terms of use cases, it's like on the, Figma is saying there's a new feature. That's fun. Take over with audio. Yeah, maybe another time. Cool. So when it comes to use cases with prototyping, it's like I put a few here and I'm going to actually show you the prototypes. So you can kind of get a feel for how I might use it and how I might start to put things together. So before I do that, does anyone have any kind of questions on anything I've laid out there? I've tried to keep it simple, so I'm not expecting anyone to have anything like super prominent, but if I've gone too fast or it doesn't make any sense, then let me know.
Hey, Cassius, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I have recently been using Balsamic, which, pitches itself as like low fidelity. I'm wondering if that sort of thing matters. Like, do you have a perspective or an opinion on whether, like, what is the appropriate fidelity level when going through these prototyping exercises?
That's a really cool question. Yes and no, and it's really context dependent. So if you're showing it to users, e.g. people who might want to use your application, they can't ignore the ugly things that you can ignore. But if you're trying to get a message across to a team of developers, or ultimately a team of people that might want to have kind of some stake in this in one way or another, sort of like a really like high level visioning piece, or even to hand it off to a designer or someone else that can start to add a bit of polish, then it's absolutely fine. But I'll give you a real good example. So there's a company I'm working with right now, that, I've noticed that Jeremy's on this call as well. So Jeremy will be familiar with some of this stuff because Jeremy was working with this lady as well. And here's a prototype that we created for basically some user feedback and some testing. So there are kind of like some linear jumps that we've tried to make, and we tried to make it really kind of like a step-by-step basis. And really the answer is, if someone is confused while clicking through this, we need to solve the problem. So, jump into it. There's an onboarding. You can click on, obviously, say who you are, etc., etc., etc. I'm not going to click through the whole thing because it'll bore you guys senseless. But this gives you an idea of kind of like the level of prototyping fidelity I'd go in to get some user feedback. Now, it looks kind of real and things are updating as people click things. But the common things you get in terms of user feedback is, oh, I wanted to click these boxes, but they didn't work. So that's the kind of stuff you have to sort of ignore. But you get it all the time anyway. Now, if I go into kind of like some of the more granular stuff around this, now, this, in my opinion, is kind of like ready for user feedback, because the idea behind this is, hey, this looks real. And while you can't click on, let's say, getting started with this or that, it's like you can sort of like see that the cars are different. You can move things around. Obviously, like, if it's quick and dirty, users are going to comment on all sorts of things. Oh, why are all the plan names the same? Like, why isn't there like some error here or there? It's like, whatever. It's like, it doesn't matter. But it will comment on it. And so you start to realize that actually the level of fidelity means the kind of feedback you're going to get, because people can't ignore these kind of things. So to give you some examples, one of the few pieces of feedback I had while creating this prototype was, why can I only click on the Thanksgiving dinner? I actually wanted to click on everything else. It's like, I don't eat Thanksgiving dinner, for example. It's like, oh, I'm a vegetarian. It's like, these are all the kind of things that you start to get with this, which is really interesting. But this is really the goal of this, was just to kind of like see where users fall over themselves more than anything else, and then start to ultimately figure out what we should and shouldn't build. So for example, this has a giant calendar view, which would be a pain in the ass to develop. But because the application itself has some calendaring features, we thought, fine, let's see what happens if we put this in there. Turns out no one wanted it. Like, everyone was like, this is ridiculous. It's like, we don't need a calendar. We're happy to manage everything externally. So we don't even, now from just creating that feedback, that prototype to get user feedback, is like, we can nix this whole feature, which is great because we can go to market loads and loads faster. So that's an example of kind of like one prototype that you could do for like user feedback. And I guess to kind of answer part of your question, Rajiv, is that users are going to moan about everything regardless of the fidelity, but the closer you can get it to making it feel real, the more feedback is going to be centered around what's happening, rather than, well, I don't like clicking gray squares. Like, Balsamic is great for like developer prototyping and everything else, but I'd probably try and like at least make it a bit more real. Some other examples of some cool prototypes actually would be sort of like, I worked with a company semi-recently called Fresher that just raised 100 million from General Atlantic. And they were looking for ways to sort of, what's a nice way to describe this? Basically improve revenue streams within their business. So this would be a visioning piece, for example. So it's kind of like taking things that already exist within their design system and just like really quickly in an ugly way, sort of mashing it together, again, with the premise of like not necessarily getting user feedback, but getting buy-in from stakeholders and management. So with this case, it's like you can be much more rough. You can be like, look, guys, ignore the fact that there's lots of Dove shampoo here. Just picture this. Like, what's happening is you're onboarding for a user that can create their own shop. And from creating their own shop, they can then, do like a Spotify-esque thing. And within their inventory, they can then start to sell all of this stuff online. They can start to manage online sales, they'll have orders, they'll have an online store, etc. So if I, for example, I pitched this to the management of like the fresher management without a prototype, and they said, we don't know what the fuck you're talking about. So just made a prototype and said, look, so this is kind of what I'm talking about. It's like, you know, imagine if we could manage all of this stuff in like a really cool synchronous way. I don't think the design language is pretty garbage, but that wasn't the goal of this, right? The goal of it was simply to kind of like get a message across and to answer sort of where from here. So that's like another use case for prototyping. And another one, which I thought was kind of cool. And so I'm just going to rattle through some use cases because people always think prototyping is just for one very specific thing. This was when I was running pledges and trying to generate partnerships for essentially the charity. What I would do is I would screenshot a page and then I would just add some text in like this. And then I would make that text clickable in a prototype. So when we were chatting with Streamlabs about integrating pledges, I'd kind of like help them see what was in my head and what we wanted to do, which would be like, hey, you're registering a charity. You want fiscal sponsorship, click here, and, you know, essentially it'll show you what that looks like. It's like, you know, this is what pledges could look like. It could kind of like fill that hole. We can kind of integrate like this. And so this didn't have to be a really granular prototype similar to the user feedback stuff. And equally, it didn't even have to be as granular as the sort of like visioning piece. It just has to be enough where someone can see like what the hell you're talking about and why it's important. So, you know, I've used prototyping for everything from like literally getting user feedback, you know, pitching new vision pieces to companies, ultimately just integrating simple things. You know, if I send out a bunch of code emails with some screenshots and how I think we can integrate and maybe some clickable prototypes, people get really excited by it. Again, like prototyping, you can just use for fun. So this was like, I don't know if anyone's heard of a tool called My Mind by a guy called Tobias von Schneider. I think he's a cool guy, but I thought his tool sucked. So I was like, cool, I'm just going to clone it and make my own prototype and see if anyone cares. So I basically made this and then sent it out to a load of users just to see if it was worth kind of like investing any dev time into it. I mean, this isn't like a VC backed project. This would just about be like a fun passion project if I was lucky. But, you know, again, it's kind of like just prototyping stuff just to see what people say, just to get my thoughts on a canvas as well. Like what happens when people start to go through this? You know, ironically, I really liked the design language for this, and everyone told me that it was kind of spacey and they didn't like it, which was sad because it's very rare that I get to pick the art direction for anything, but there you go. Beggars can't be choosers. So that's kind of like another use case, again, for fun. And sometimes, you know, really, and I haven't put anything here because I'll take you through some stuff, like sometimes prototyping is just for the case of, yeah, oh shit, like I'm really stuck. I have no idea what to do here. I have no idea what people are going to say, think, feel. And that's where you start to get into the world of essentially kind of like, you know, if I just show you the sidebar here, just iterations, like you end up in a situation where you have one set of prototypes here, then you have another iteration and another iteration and another iteration. And you realize that, you know, suddenly we're on iteration 1.8 and it's been, you know, 2 and a bit weeks. So prototyping for me it's one of those things where the use case really matters. And by framing the problem statement well, you can define like why the hell you should be investing any time into a prototype at all. Now, for me, I'm a designer, so I rarely use no-code tools for anything. I'd rather just design something and put it in front of people because it's much quicker for me. And then if people buy in, then I can decide if I need to invest some capital in it or ultimately kind of like, you know, gently convince people to build it for me, which does tend to happen if I have some kind of like, you know, proof of concept or use case or good user feedback. And I think, let's see if I've got any more fun kind of like prototypes that I can show off here. Showcase, this is a fresh inventory. I think I don't have anything very specific outside of what I've shown you guys because my Figma is semi-well organized at the moment. It seems like I've done the right thing of not working on a bazillion projects at once. So I guess that, you know, handing things over, what else would you guys like to know about prototyping? And again, you have to give me a little hand here because this is so sort of like second nature for me and how I go around this. It's like, do you want to learn more about kind of like what the process looks like when I find inspiration and kind of start hacking things around? It's like, obviously, I don't think anyone's that concerned about seeing what I would do in terms of like actually creating something. So like if no one has any steering, then I'll kind of, oh, yeah, Harold, do you have a question?
Yes. My question is around level of effort. I guess your background is, you know, product design and you kind of live in Figma, kind of live in this world.
Yeah.
And a lot of time there's this like, I want to prototype, but I don't want to spend all my time with just like getting that fidelity. Like how do you go about balancing that, right? Because if you want it to be a good prototype, you have to spend a lot of time in it. Like, but it does take effort. How do you balance that level of effort?
I mean, so it looks like I spend a lot of effort on this stuff, but honestly, I don't. So I cheat all the time. Like I have 3 relatively good UI kits that I kind of just default back to start with whenever I kind of want inspiration for something. So the the design encyclopedia is a pretty good one. You just kind of like, essentially, if I show you what it looks like, you basically just go, okay, cool, I want to create a homepage, and maybe you just scroll around and be like, okay, cool, there's all these features. Okay, let's look at page header. Okay, there's that. I mean, this is all dashboard stuff actually, but visualizations, order summary. But for example, sometimes you can literally just find things like this that are like completely comped, and you can be like, well, if I need a calendar, I'm going to use something like this. Or I need a YouTube clone, I'm going to use something like this. And again, it's kind of like, there's something really cool I found recently called System Flow, which I think is by some cool like European dudes that have put it together. And basically they've created this Figma file where they've actually like mirrored everything that they've created in Figma in Webflow. So you could literally, and I'll just show you what it is. They've got like templates for like different headers, sections, and everything else that you can just really quickly put it together. And so there's a guy who, and this is going to be fun context, and I'm glad this is being recorded so I can share this with everyone. Basically, I can't breathe through my left nostril. And I was like, oh, I don't really want to pay for plastic surgery. It sounds like a lot of money. So I reached out to a plastic surgeon. I was like, look, if I just redesign part of your website that makes you lots of money, can you fix my left nostril so I can breathe through it? He said, yeah, sure. And I was like, well, I don't really want to spend all my time, designing a nice page for you. So I just used that System Flow thing to basically grab all of this stuff and then whack it into like, what is now a really raw prototype. And I'm just gonna, add some copy and then add some images in, and then I'm just gonna drag and drop the same components from this like Webflow kit into Webflow and say, hey, I'll fix this for you. It's like, can you now fix my nose? And that's sort of, that's the level of effort you can go to. It depends, right? So what your goals and your motivations are will dictate how far you push forwards with this. Like for me, it's like, obviously I'd like to breathe from my left nostril, but I'd like to change the world a little bit more. So it's like, I'm not going to put my life into this. But obviously with certain projects, it's like, I will, because I'm really excited about them. So that's, for me, again, it just becomes, what do you want from this? Like, what's the problem statement? If the problem statement is, are we creating something that's like developer ready? That's very different to, oh, can I just get something quick and dirty out into the world? Like this, for example, every single one of these tabs is a separate prototype. So if I was to hand this off to a developer and I was to put this into kind of like user stories, they'd understand what's going on very quickly. So I tend to kind of, this is again, really high, like product level stuff. But for example, what I tend to do with people is I'd create like a roadmap. We just drop a load of user stories in it. So, essentially these can become technical requirements in the future, but from a design or prototyping perspective, it doesn't really need to be. Like, for example, as a user, I want the ability to sync certain plans on my calendar. Cool, fine. How might we solve that? Well, maybe I'll whack, let's see if I've got one where there's an embedded Figma file. There's no embedded Figma file here. Let's have a look at pledges. There should be some old stuff in here. Ready to build. Everything's built. Look at that. Fantastic. Yeah, users can authenticate their identity through a mobile KYC AML integration, and then I'd link a prototype in the bottom of it. And again, that's kind of like a clickable developer ready workflow where you could see how to go through that and what to do with it. Like that's like IC level, right? So if you're an individual contributor and you need to do this kind of stuff and you're the only like designer or product person in the team, that makes loads of sense. If you're the founder of a company and you just want to get something across the line, it's like, this is way too much. Like I would honestly just steal a UI kit, like any of the ones that I have here, like System Flow, Design Encyclopedia, Tailwind, and I would just drag and drop stuff across. There's actually loads of good resources if you wanted to just steal stuff in the first place. Like, let's see, there's like, if I don't know if any of you guys have heard of things like UI8. UI8 is a really useful tool. You can just go on here and kind of like grab like pre-made landing pages and change the copy. You can do the same thing with like applications. All of this stuff is like super easy and super quick to do. And I do it all the time. If I want to figure out what something looks like and I don't want it to be custom, then this is what happens first. And it's the same with the UI kit stuff. Like if I want to put lots and lots and lots of effort into something, then maybe what I do is I'd go to some inspiration websites like see evernote.design, and I just look through kind of like, one of the many various links here and start to figure things out. So, there's stuff like page flows, which has like user onboarding for loads of popular apps. You don't have to download loads of random applications on your phone. There's patterns as well, which does the same thing. Again, like landing page ninja has lots and lots of inspiration. So this is the kind of stuff that I might go through if I want to do something like really cool and quirky. But 9 out of 10 times in like the world that we all live in, it's like that you just don't have time for that. So I guess the long-winded way to answer your question is steal as much as you can from as many places as possible just to prove the point, and then hand it off to an IC. It's like, that's what I would do if I just finished raising a round or I didn't need to be the designer. But if I'm the sole IC, it's like I can be a little bit more kind of like finicky and granular with things, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
No worries at all. So are there any other kind of like questions? I'm really conscious that I'm not sure how to best answer or kind of like talk about prototyping unless I have some prompts.
I was curious. What's the difference in terms of the population of people who do user testing with prototypes versus with a fully completed MVP of a site?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of like the percentage of people that do that, I couldn't tell you. What I can tell you, if I go back to this example here, so if I go back to the example that I have here with this kind of like calendaring application, if I hadn't put that in front of users, we would have built a calendar, and that would have been a load of technical debt and design debt to some extent that we just didn't need. We would have been like, this would have been a great thing to build because we thought it was. Now, if I was to answer the question of, is it pot calling kettle black sort of thing? How often have I put things in front of users quickly enough to stop building something? Not very often. It really comes to a point where if I'm really stuck and I have no idea what to do next, I'll put things in front of users. I can be a bit stubborn and I can be a bit sort of like pedantic about what I think is the right answer, especially when something becomes more and more abstract, because people don't know what they want until you show it to them. And sometimes a prototype doesn't get the right thing across, like, especially if you're not a design focused founder or product focused founder, because you can end up in a situation where you show someone an ugly duckling and they shoot it down and you go, no, you just can't see what I can see. But I would say that if you had to put a gun to my head 9 out of 10 times and say, how much conviction do you have to build this without showing someone first? I'd say, yeah, not enough. It's like, if I can show it to someone, I'll show it to someone. And yeah, I was
going to say, so, but it's the same set of customers you'd be showing your fully completed app to. It's like the same group of people.
Yeah, absolutely. So to put it into perspective of this, there's a bunch of alpha users that kind of were the initial user testing group. And then we just got them back on calls and we showed them the prototype and we let them click through it on their own terms. Because the idea obviously is if you know the target audience that you want to interact with, then just get them to give you the feedback and to kind of hack around with it. Now, obviously, what you do with that is up to you. Sometimes you might be like, oh, actually, it's like these are the wrong people because actually the product I want to create is going to have to do it this way and it might not serve that market. But obviously, if you're a solution looking for a problem, then the world is a very different and a much tougher place than if you're listening to your users in the first instance. So yeah, I'd always show the same users this stuff. Especially if you know that they're technical, then their level of technical knowledge as well. And it's very easy to incentivize people to want to take part in prototypes. It can be as easy as get them on a call, and if you really send out an email to your whole list and they're not interested, then offer them a $50 Amazon gift card. It's like, if you spend $2,000 on Amazon, it's like, you've saved God knows how much in engineering time anyway.
Cool. Okay.
If you're done, can I ask the next question? So
sure.
Let's say you're testing something like this with the user. Oh, here, let me turn my camera on, sorry. So how manual is your testing process? Like, let's say you test with 5 users and all of them are saying, the calendar, I don't want that. Like for the following users, do you say, don't even worry about the calendar app, like let's not go there? Do you kind of say, you can click on Happy Thanksgiving or hosting Thanksgiving dinner, but nothing else? How manual is your testing process? Or do you just put it in front of them and just ask them to write down notes and kind of step back?
Yeah, let me see if I can show you. Dovetail app. So this is like a user research app, which is lots of fun. Go to app. Am I still signed in? Sweet. Yeah, cool. So for example, we did lots and lots and lots of kind of like user interviews here. And even though you start to hear the same things, once you've scheduled all the interviews and you've got people to test it, you just let them test it and you just see what they're going to say. Even if you think that you have the right answer, if you have 10 interviews, it's like, just go through them. Really, the case is like, when you stop learning new things, stop the interviews. So for example, we had around 10 and we realized we weren't learning anything new after that. So we just canceled the remainder. It's like, so be it. It's like, there's no point in going through that same stuff. It's like, we just said, look, we're going to come back to you guys when we've like shipped the next iteration. But the process was like identical for pretty much all of this. It's like, essentially, this is just like a transcript. Like, people were just clicking through it, and then I just highlighted the things that were like pretty important, and like, I'd tag it, etc., etc., etc. But I wouldn't ever stop. It's like, so, there's some stuff which is like focused on the prototype, which is why I was confused. I was actually in a range with like, I didn't realize that it was Gmail until you told me. So, okay, cool, whatever. And we heard that a couple of times, but we just kept going through the interviews. So typically what I'd say is, if you have 10 interviews scheduled for that day, finish the day. And then with the rest of them say, look, guys, it's like, we'll come back to you. It's like, thank you for wanting to participate, but it's cool. Like, I'd always just get to a point where you feel like you're not going to hear anything new, and then say, okay, well, we'll come back to it. And we only took 10 interviews for this, for us to get to the point where it's like, we stopped hearing new things. And then, here's like all the random highlights, which allowed us to kind of like start to make decisions. But this is a nice knowledge base for this kind of stuff. So that's my opinion on that. It's like, I would never tell a user that, oh, ignore this or do that. It's like, just let them say it, because the more you guide them, the more they're kind of just going to try and guess the teacher's password, which you don't want anyway. And then finish your interviews for a day, and then cancel the rest for the remainder of the week if you don't hear anything new anymore. That's what I'd say. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Cool.
Hi, I had a, oh shoot, I'm looping.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I had a question more about just design in general. What do you have any recommendations? Sorry, it's like looping my own text through my earphones because I'm using two different things. Do you have any advice on like how to improve design skills, or like what courses or books would be good to read?
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of improving design skills, so I'd never read a book, because books are really tough to learn design from, largely because you only really get a lot of, so design is one of those skills, and there's actually a lot of research into this, where the problem here is that no one's really spent a lot of time trying to make all of the tacit rules explicit. And so it's like, I can give you some very kind of like arbitrary rules, and I'll try and show you, just to give you an example. Like, I could say, what would be a really nice one to do this with? Right, let's just grab this text here. I could just say to you, right, okay, so this text roughly, it's like, if you want it to be like visually pleasing, then you need to make sure that, if I detach it from the header, the line spacing is no more than, let's say, 1.5 times the size of the text. But the problem with that is that there's loads of instances where that's not true. Like, for example, now this is way too far apart. Whereas here, it's like, that actually would kind of work. You see? So it's like arbitrary rules like that. This is why you end up with some websites where things just look kind of like janky in places they shouldn't, because when you try and follow rules, it's like they don't always apply well with design. So the way I learned to design, and the way I'd probably recommend anyone learns to design is, or to improve their design skills, is to, first of all, just trace things. So one thing I used to do all the time, and I mean, I don't think anyone's gonna do this here, but let's give myself a plug, right? So if I went on my own website, and oh, what a nice illustration. Oh, Cassius is such a talented illustrator. Anyway, so if we go to Figma, and I just grab, like, say, a screenshot of something, what I would then do is I would literally just kind of like say, well, I like this website, how am I going to recreate it? And I would just start to trace things over it and start to kind of like figure out what the sizing and everything else was. And I did that with a lot of very popular mainstream sites like Stripe and everything else. And it's kind of, and it seems like it's a kind of like weird and stupid thing to do, but by doing it, it's like forces you to learn to recreate things, and you start to internalize why things have been done that way. Because all of the weird rules that people give you, it's like, you just don't get better at designing things for it. Now, this specifically is for like visual design. So this will make you a better visual designer, but it won't make you any better at kind of like user experience or otherwise. I find that the best way to get better at that stuff is the same way that you become a much better developer, is you just kind of try and get involved in any project where you can start to contribute and start to figure out what some of those problems look like. So the sad thing with design is that there's no sort of system where it's like open design, where you can just go and contribute to like source files or design files or get involved with like a community of people building things. Whereas you can with kind of like, you know, anything to do with like development, you could just, you know, jump into an open source library and start to hack around, like, you know, you can start to push things and do all kinds of fun stuff. But I would say that the best way to get better at design really would be to just create things and start by kind of tracing things if you want to become a better visual designer, and then start by asking yourself questions around, okay, cool, why do I like these applications? It's like, how could I, you know, maybe you like Duolingo, maybe you just say, okay, cool, what are the cool elements of Duolingo? What happens if I tried to create Duolingo for, let's think of something ridiculous that would be really cool. What if I tried to create Duolingo for, oh, my mind's completely blank. Maybe Duolingo is the worst example. What if I tried to create Duolingo for, I don't know, like tennis players? Like, how could I do that? What would that look like? What would they need to see? Or something that you're passionate about. That's how I learned to design. And ultimately, it's like, if you can just get yourself into some communities that are just willing to be ruthless and give you some feedback, that helps a lot. So those would be kind of like my high level recommendations. I've never had any luck with books. They do a lot in terms of making you sound very intelligent. You know, there's nothing better than to be able to use words like, you know, kerning, leading, tracking, and ultimately, you know, reading Christopher Alexander's work is fantastic, but it's all sort of, you know, it's just, you know, babble, and it sounds good and it'll help you win clients, but it doesn't really make that much difference in the grand scheme of things. So that would be my suggestion. It's like, it's thinking out loud. I would say, find things you like. If you want to become a better visual designer, clone them. If you want to become better at experience design, take things where you think they have a good experience and then kind of repurpose and reformat them a little bit. And if you can do that within a team, that's even better. And then finally, it would be a case of just surround yourself with ruthless people that are happy to give you feedback. I can't even tell you how many times when I first started learning how to design, the word start again was thrown at me. And, you know, it's a bit cruel, but at the end of the day, it's like, it worked. So that would be my personal opinion on this. I'm very big on design education, and I think the whole kind of system of design education is fundamentally broken right now. So it's like, I think there's some thread that's worth fixing there. But outside of, you know, what I've suggested, and maybe a couple of really good YouTubers, I can't think of anything that I would comfortably recommend for you to become a good designer.
Awesome, thank you so much.
Hey Cassius, great session so far. One question that I have is trying to divide like the mom test style of interview with I want feedback on the specific thing.
Yeah.
Sometimes it can be a bit awkward switching from like, tell me about your life in a very sort of divergent way. And then like, okay, this hopefully, this prototype hopefully fits in with the problem that you have described, and then you can kind of dive into it. But yeah, thoughts on balancing the two? Are they separate interviews? Yeah, how to approach that?
So you learn a lot about people when you show them a prototype. So let's see if I can pick up on some fun stuff. Oh, it's my website again. Anyway, some fun stuff around, let's see. So some of these, for example, when we were giving these user interviews, we learned a lot about people because they'd explain more about their lives contextually with the things that we've shown them, which we wouldn't have got if we had like a one-to-one style. So talk to me about the last time you faced this problem, or when was the, you know, what have you done previously to try and solve this? So what I would say is that they're kind of two separate conversations, because one is much more focused on understanding an individual and creating like a persona or an avatar, or at least a model in your head where you can say, okay, I'm starting to relate to this individual. Whereas when you're kind of showing them a prototype, what you're really saying is, I think I understand your model, and I think that my map of the world is similar to your map now. Like, let's discuss that and tell me how that doesn't work. And typically when you kind of both collide, you start to realize that, you know, the territory might look different anyway, and both of your maps need some updating. So I guess the short answer to this is, you're going to learn lots about your users when you put prototypes in front of them, because they have to tell you contextually why they do things, and you're going to want to ask the questions. But I would never sort of jump into a user interview and show them a prototype and expect to kind of like balance both of those things. I'd say that people get very tired very quickly, in the sense of, they can get quite exhausted through these things, especially if they're trying to figure things out and you're trying to figure things out. So I just, have one goal. And typically I would start by saying, okay, cool, let's have an interview to understand more about you and your model of the world. And then if they're ideal users for what you want to see or test the kind of like prototypes or what an MVP would look like, then I'd put the prototype in front of them and I'd say, okay, cool. Like, what are your thoughts on this? I'd never merge the two. And if it's like a fresh user, it's a fresh user. Say, hi, hi, I'm Noah. It's really nice to meet you. Today, we're going to be doing this. Here's a link to the prototype. Really looking forward to seeing, really looking forward to the next 20 minutes. Have you ever used the prototype before? Oh, no, I haven't. Cool. So when you click on the screen, a blue box will flash. That's the thing you can click on. If you try to click on something, there's no blue box, nothing will happen. And that's fine as well. So work through this. If you get stuck, then I'm going to pipe up. But whenever you have any thoughts, let me know. And then you just chime in. It's like, oh, why did you click this? It's like, oh, sorry. Like, I've just noticed you tried to do that. What made you think, what was going through on in your mind there? Like, I just keep it very prototype focused. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So a little bit of context at the beginning is okay. Maybe verify that they have the type of problem that you're trying to solve, but beyond that, just throw them at the prototype and
throw them at the prototype.
Run with it.
Yeah, to give you a really good example, it's like all of the people we interviewed here none of them had really used a prototype. If I can't really play the video because it would be nuts, but for example, it's like people had no idea what was going on. They were like, oh, I've never clicked this thing before. It's like, oh, why can't I do this? Like, which I wish I could find the one where it was like, it said, I don't like Thanksgiving dinner. It was, it is what it is. Yeah, that's.
And did you pre-qualify those people?
Yeah, these are people
beyond like.
Cool. Yeah, these are people who are already part of the alpha. So these are people who had already previously had interviews which suggested they were the right type of character for the product. So they'd already been kind of like, they'd done some questionnaires and surveys and stuff. And they worked very closely with the founder of this company, Bridget, to kind of essentially help her shape what would be like V1. And so they were very happy to kind of like keep going backwards and forwards here. So they already had some context. They kind of like thought that they kind of knew what they wanted, that they were looking to see. So to some extent, you can argue that it's like they were primed, but I'd like to think that because the conversations are so high level, it would be the same way as you having like a really good marketing page or a home page, and then a user kind of like gets into your application from there. It's like that should give them enough context to understand why they're doing what they're about to do. But yeah, these people were all people who had previously interacted with the product. And you'd want that for the first like 10, 15, 20 like really ugly interviews, because otherwise you end up explaining to people what you're doing and why you're here. And if you already have people happy, they're on board and like super stoked to be here, it's like, there's no need to kind of like, just find random people. You would in the future, probably, if you wanted to kind of like, expand your audience and do some other bits and pieces. But even then, I think there's better ways of testing that than throwing a prototype in front of them.
Cool. Excellent. Thank you.
What tool are you using to get the transcript there?
Cool. So this is just a tool called Dovetail. So Dovetail is kind of like essentially the GitHub for user research. So you can just grab Zoom recordings, audio recordings, or anything else, and you can throw them into Dovetail. And it does a good job of like essentially allowing you to organize things by interviews, like tags, so features, pain points, and then highlights, so that you can share things with other people later down the line. And you can say, okay, so here's some features I think we should ship. These are the reasons why. Oh, these things are pain points. So it's really useful for understanding what you need to do next, as well as where you are, and kind of answering that question of where from here. Again, like I said, it's like we would have built a calendar had someone had most of the users now not turned around and said, well, I don't think we need this. Like, why is it here? It's like, I thought I could manage this from my calendar. It's like, okay, cool. It's like problem solved. So yeah, Dovetail is really good for that.
Another question, expanding on the stuff that you were just talking about, my last question, thoughts on getting a community engaged. So I guess if you're talking one-to-one, that's like the highest touch, but I'm seeing a lot of like, your onboarding might even dump you into a Slack community or a Discord or having an email list. How do you kind of farm out in a more distributed way, getting them excited about the product, but also surfacing feedback?
Yeah, bloody hell. So what's a really good example of this? Shit, let's see if I think this might work. So I do have a good example about this somewhere. So current, is it with me in draft, shared, alpha? This would be my
While you're
bad.
pulling that up, like, would you ever put a prototype on a Slack and say, just like react en masse to this thing, or is that too instructive?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. If you have got, I mean, I'd drop anything in the SPC Slack quite happily and be like, guys, like,
Yeah.
does this make sense? Like, no, I mean, you know, to within reason, like if I thought that you guys were the right target audience, 100%. If I thought that there would be, I might preface it, for example, and say, oh, hey, actually, is there anyone that's like looking at X, Y, Z? Like, would you like to see a prototype? I guess because if I did one right now, which was about cooking, and I said, can everyone go through this? And the first piece of feedback I got was, I don't ever cook, sorry. It's like, yeah, fuck, you know, what a waste of everyone's time. But yeah, I would have no problem dropping something in Slack, provided it was the right Slack. When it comes to users and communities, I'm trying to see if I have the prototypes for this here. So I was part of a company called 3 Billion Pairs, where I was actually doing a load of cool like genetic stuff until there was like, you know, a couple of random bits and pieces that changed. But with the company, essentially, we had a giant Discord community of like random geneticists and everything else. And they were always asking questions around like, oh, what's this platform going to look like? What's it going to do? Like, what are all these fun things that are going to happen? And I just said, well, why not, like, you know, I can't tell you because it's like, to be honest, it's like, you know, we're still like in the visioning piece. Oh, Figma's dead. What's that thing? Let me see if I can get it close to this to remove some things. But yeah, essentially I posted just comps. I just posted comps in the Discord just to get people excited. And I was thinking people aren't going to understand what's going on here. They're not going to care about anything that's being said, but they really did care. And they were really happy and excited that I showed them. So, you know, you can very easily drop a prototype into a Discord or a community of people that you're already interacting with, and they can get very excited, even if they can only see what it could be. I mean, bear in mind, VCs are exactly the same as just regular people, right? They just want to know what things could be. So if you can drop something in a pitch deck to get people excited, then you can do the same thing with normal users, and they will absolutely get excited by it if they're excited by your product. Let's see if I can grab it here, or if I can just show you the comp actually, like it literally is here. Cool. So this was like, this basically outside of a dribble shot was the only thing I showed people in the community. So we just grabbed that comp, we just threw it down and we said, look, this is what we're looking to build. Here's some context on that. It's like, we want a operating system that does X, Y, Z. It's like, this is where our thoughts are right now. And they were super ecstatic about this. I mean, this comp and some documents, which unfortunately I can't show you because Figma's been a bit weird, raised 2.5 million at post money of 12. So it's kind of like, you can show people things, you can get them excited. You don't need to have super granular prototypes. Sometimes if you just want to get thoughts on things, get thoughts on things. There's no harm. Like no one is ever going to turn around and give you what would be useless feedback. If they don't like it, accept that they don't like it. Now, you don't necessarily need to listen to the reason why, because a lot of people rationalize things for like absolutely no good reason at all. But it's like the grain or the thread that they're pulling on is usually a good one.
Super cool. Thank you.
Cool. How else can I be most useful to you guys outside of just randomly showing you like pieces of my work, which I think would be cool?
Is this prototype right here that we're looking at?
No, this was just an example. Like this is just a website put together in Webflow. So this is just an example of what I posted in the Discord for this company to show them kind of like what the project could look like. I was trying to find the prototype for this in my Figma, but for some reason my Figma is playing up now. It's not playing ball with me at all. But all of the things in here are prototypes, for example. So if you're in the Figma file, it's like, you know, all of these little blue arrows are basically the things that denote a prototype, and say you can kind of like go through things. And then this one's a bit messy, but it does the job still. Cool. So if there's no more questions, then I'm quite conscious that I'm not sure what else to try and download or what else I can do to sort of like, you know, explain my prototyping process. And this is I'll give you a little waffle, and then if there's nothing else, you guys can hop along and enjoy your day. So design is one of those very weird things where making things explicit is quite hard sometimes, because when you interact with people on a consistent basis, you realize how messy people are. And you realize that a lot of the things that you'd like to make incredibly explicit in a way that you can give rules or ideas or specific patterns for people to follow, that's not easy to do by any stretch, because every time you're interacting with people, creating a prototype, regardless of the use case, you're trying to play a different game. And as I'm trying to share some of this information with you, I'm trying to essentially relive playing those games and talk to you a little bit about how I played them and why they were useful, and perhaps what I can take away from them. But really the key to all of this is that no matter what you're doing with prototyping, regardless of whether it's like high level or low level or anything in between, it's like really like your goal is just to define where from here. And so every use case you create, everything in between, it's like you just want a prototype to say, okay, well, what should I do next? And the only way to frame that is to say, this is the problem I want to solve, and this is kind of where I want to be. And the prototype just marries those things. And, you know, it doesn't have to be a design prototype. It doesn't have to be, you know, comps. It can be anything that lets you answer that question to some extent. I mean, I realize I'm quite biased. I've just sat around with Figma this whole time, but it could be a type form. You know, a type form could get the same job done. A Google form could get the same job done. And I've used those to kind of hack around with before and get the feedback that I need. Surprisingly, some applications I've worked on have just been like repurposed WhatsApp groups. So it's like, why should I design or build anything when it's like, if I can get people into a WhatsApp group and see if I can change their behavior, it's like, that might be enough to answer the question, where from here? So that's my sort of like high level spiel around prototyping. And this is my gracious attempt to try to download all of these things that are very tacit into something that's explicit, which is very hard to do, especially when you spend your time, you know, moving pixels around in a nice fluffy way. So.
Are there any other tools that you like to use besides Figma and Dovetail?
Yeah, I mean, so what kind of, for any specific purpose? Because I mean,
any sort of general design or user testing thing.
Yeah, cool. So Rajiv mentioned Balsamiq. Balsamiq is really nice because Balsamiq is kind of like, you know, a built-in kind of like wireframing tool, so you can just drag and drop things very quickly. It's a good way of sort of saying, handing something off to someone and say, this is kind of what I'm thinking, like. And if you're happy with the logic, you can get engineering to start building it. I mean, you know, that's the premise, is that sometimes with Balsamiq, it's like you actually understand what the technical specifications are without even kind of like needing to kind of like have some like, you know, very nicely designed comps. I like using Notion for kind of like managing like user stories and like a Kanban style. I think that's really useful. The reason I think user stories are really useful, just for context on things, is because a lot of people want to get very granular very quickly. And the problem here is that when we are in the 0 to 1 stage, like the 1 to 10 stage, nothing is really that fixed, set, or defined. Most of the problems that we have right now are problems where it's like, how might we? And really a lot of them are visioning problems. So a user story just allows you to kind of say, okay, how might we solve this problem? You know, so how might we enable someone to do this? How might we enable someone to do that? And I think that's a nice way of working. And then obviously, if you have prototypes, you can just give them to developers and they turn them into technical specifications. You know, I don't like working too closely with like, you know, features and ideas first, until it's kind of like, well, why don't we see what might work first, and then kind of like start to download stuff into that. But I'd say that I'm very low maintenance when it comes to tooling. Figma does a good job. Balsamiq does a good job. Notion is good. Dovetail. Again, like inspiration websites are really useful. Things like, you know, like Evernote.design, if you want to kind of like figure out what to kind of like look at. This is just basically a giant list of like every inspiration website you could ever want to look at. UI8 for UI kits is good. You can grab some UI kits and hack around with them there. What else do I kind of use in terms of tooling, which is also quite useful? Again, kind of like some of the UI kits I've picked up here. It's like, they're really cool places to start. System Flow, Design Encyclopedia, Tailwind. Like System Flow, I think, is actually really good, especially if you want to kind of like be able to just mirror things in Webflow. And Webflow is generally a nice tool to use for kind of like, you know, landing pages, etc., just because it's very quick to kind of like change copy, etc. And more than that, you don't need to be the person that does it. Someone non-technical can jump into the CMS and just literally type and change the copy and images, which is really cool. And there's no like sort of overheads with it. So yeah, that's my kind of like general tooling for this. There's nothing that I'd say is, hey, like I have all of these cool fun hacks and everything else. I've tried them. I've tried all kinds of, you know, arbitrary ways of making things really, really fast and really, really like cool. And I have a couple of ideas for like design automation tools, which, you know, might end up being my next venture in the future, but nothing like that I'd say, if you don't use this, then, you know, you're missing a trick.
Thanks.
I think I speak for everyone wanting a list of links for all the interesting tools and UI kits and so on that you showed off. If you could compile that down, or if anyone is taking notes, that'd be fantastic.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I'm very happy to do that. I can yeah, put together a list of like things that I think are useful, and then everyone can walk away with. That's no issue at all. Cool.
Thank you so much.
No, it's all good. All right. Well, I hope this has been useful for everyone. And, you know, if anyone needs anything, then, you know, just feel free to ping me on Slack anyway. I'm happy to do what I can to, again, like I said, download some of this stuff and just give some advice. I've done this so many times for everyone from kind of like startups to enterprise. So if you've seen a kind of like design related problem or like product related problem, I've probably solved it at one point. So cool.
Thanks, Cassius.
Thank you.
Thank you
very
so
much.
much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.